and Pride Sameach. My name is Seth Marnin, and I have the great privilege of serving as the chair of Keshet's board of directors. Now, those of you who have heard me speak at, well, really anything, know that I cannot pass up the opportunity to share just a little bit of Torah. This week's Parsha, Shlach, concludes with the mitzvah of tzitzit. God tells Moshe to tell the Israelites to attach fringes to the corners of their garments and to look at the fringe and recall and observe the commandments. One of the earliest Midrashic collections claims that the commandment of tzitzit is as important as all the other commandments together, and that for those who regularly wear tzitzit, it's considered as if they've observed all the mitzvot. Did you catch that? Just wearing and looking at the tzitzit, it's as if you've observed all the commandments. Not bad. The Talmud describes the process. Seeing leads to remembering, and remembering leads to action. So what are we seeing that leads us to remember and act? We're seeing unrelenting attacks on LGBTQ people, especially our trans youth. These attacks have come in the form of don't say gay bills, bans on trans athletes participating on sports teams, bathroom bans, disclosure requirements, and obstacles to, if not outright bans on healthcare, especially for minors. And we're also seeing pride celebrations in Jewish communal spaces across the country, synagogues, schools, JCCs. We see summer camps about to open, more prepared than ever by Keshet to welcome our LGBTQ plus youth. And we see a brand new Keshet organized coalition of national and local Jewish organizations standing ready to use our collective power to stand up against laws and policies that harm LGBTQ plus youth and the broader LGBTQ community. Seeing leads to remembering, and remembering leads to action. It is my great honor this evening to introduce to you two remarkable people who have spent their lives seeing, remembering, and acting. First, I'm pleased to introduce to you Keshet's President and CEO, Idit Klein. Idit has grown Keshet from a budget of $42,000 and a staff of 1 to a budget of more than $4 million and a staff of close to 30 on the ground in Boston, New York, Miami, Chicago, and San Francisco. A visionary leader with chutzpah, compassion, and a steadfast commitment to LGBTQ Jews and the Jewish community, Idit has built Keshet into an organization that supports synagogues, JCCs, youth movements, summer camps, and other Jewish institutions in becoming communities where LGBTQ Jews can feel at home. An organization that mobilizes these communities to fight for LGBTQ civil rights, and an organization that creates safe, supportive, celebratory, and empowering spaces for queer Jewish teens to be their full selves. This past year, we honored Idit's 20th anniversary at Keshet with a campaign, Dare to Dream, to raise funds for Keshet's growth. We set an initial goal of raising $200,000 and raised more than $600,000 to honor Idit. And thank you to all of you who contributed. And we'll hear in just a bit from Idit about Keshet's plans for the future. And now, of course, I have the honor of introducing the joy of our pride and joy, Joy Ladin. Joy has been an active member of the Keshet community for years, a former board colleague, now an emerita board member, and a recipient of Keshet's Chachmat Lev Award, an award that recognizes and honors wisdom of the heart and the wisdom of the head. Joy is a prolific and beautiful writer, a published poet and essayist, a literary scholar, and nationally known speaker on transgender issues. Joy was one of the first out transgender professors at an Orthodox institution, a tenured professor who held the David and Ruth Gottesman Chair in English at Stern College for Women of Yeshiva University. Her 2019 work, The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective, to me exemplifies what I find so profoundly moving about Joy. She is deeply traditional, fearless, she doesn't cross boundaries so much as conjure a world where boundaries, rather than serve as limits, become the center on which understanding, wisdom, and love can thrive. In living her life as herself, Joy has contributed not only to the creation of a world that sustains LGBTQ plus people, but to a stronger, more vibrant, audacious, and meaningful Jewish community. Tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing her read selections from her 10th book of poetry, Shekhinah Speaks, that was published just last month. I'm now going to turn it over to Idit and Joy.
Thank you so much, Seth, for those words of Torah and for introducing Joy and me and welcoming all of us to be here tonight. And thank you to all of you for coming together. I'm so grateful to each of you who contributed to the Dare to Dream campaign. I still feel in awe of what we were able to accomplish together. And I also want to give a huge thanks to our amazing campaign co-chairs, Ellie Gorak and Liana Krupp, and our entire campaign leadership team. Thank you so much. The funds raised through Dare to Dream will go so far to strengthen Keshet's youth programs, expand our capacity to mobilize Jewish communities to advance LGBTQ rights, and enable us to continue to grow creatively and strategically. This summer, we are diving into a system-wide comprehensive analysis of Keshet's infrastructure so we can move into the future growing most wisely, effectively, and sustainably. And of course, as Seth indicated just a bit ago, this ability to invest in Keshet's growth could not come at a more important time. On the one hand, it's a time of unprecedented energy for fostering LGBTQ equality and belonging in Jewish life. And on the other hand, it's a time of unprecedented attacks on hard-won LGBTQ rights, most acutely and most devastatingly on the rights and the very lives of transgender youth. Already in 2022, we've seen over 300 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in state legislatures. But I'm very glad to be here tonight to tell you that our Jewish communities are responding as never before. Through our work mobilizing Jewish communities nationwide to take action, we are seeing more people take action than we ever have in the past. And we are seeing thousands and thousands of Jewish community members who are taking action for LGBTQ rights for the very first time in their lives. Thank you to all of you for standing with us and for making this work possible. So when we talked about what we wanted to do to mark the successful close of the Dare to Dream campaign and to honor Pride Month, and we learned that Joy Ladin could be with us tonight, I was thrilled. Joy is a longtime leader and dear friend of Keshet's, and you heard about that from Seth before. She is an extraordinary writer and thinker and poet and scholar and visionary for a more just world. Joy always inspires me, sometimes agitates me, always in a good way, and always moves me. Always moves me to feel and to think in deeper and more expansive ways. I'm so excited to talk together with you, Joy, tonight and to hear from your newest collection of poetry. And I invite you now to share a selection of poems from your newest and extraordinarily 10th collection of poetry, Shekhinah Speaks.
Thank you so much, Idit, and thank you, Seth. And I'm hoping that I'm not too choked up from the introductions to actually read poems. I'm very grateful to get to be here with everyone, and I'm so grateful to Keshet for the leadership that you're providing and the light that you're creating in such dark times. You keep giving me hope every day. I'm going to start by reading poems. Well, actually, let me just say the collection Shekhinah Speaks is a collection of poems that attempt to turn my poetry over to the Shekhinah, who in Jewish tradition is the female aspect of God. And this is an idea that grew in rabbinic tradition. There was an increasingly male-identified concept of God as being transcendent, beyond history, giving laws, judging, exercising power. And as the Jewish people's suffering increased in the wake of the Roman destruction of the temple, I think there was a longing to have another way of thinking about God that would enable us to feel close to God. And the Shekhinah grew into that concept. The idea of the Shekhinah is that where the male identified God, the idea of God is transcendent, the Shekhinah is immanent. She is with us. She's with each one of us at every moment and experiences everything that we experience. So the rabbis say, God sends Israelites into exile. The Shekhinah goes into exile with the Israelites. She dances at our weddings. She cries at our funerals. This is particularly moving to me because my mother's funeral was last Thursday. So I wanted to, in good gender binary fashion, because the male identified aspect of God does a lot of talking, the Shekhinah is silent. She doesn't get to speak in our tradition. But I wanted to know what she has to say. And I'll talk a little bit more with Idit about how I did that. But the important thing for right now is that in these poems, it isn't me speaking. It is the Shekhinah. And she's addressing a human you, which to her is each one of us. She sees us from the inside out. And to her, each of us, we look so similar. She knows us individually, but we look so similar from the inside out that she only needs one singular you to address each of us. I'm going to start with poems that highlight the strong strain of mother imagery throughout the book. This is called Fetus in Distress, and each of the poems is made out of words that are sampled from a text in Isaiah and a text that resonates with it from Cosmopolitan magazine. And the Isaiah text here includes the epigraph, "For a long time I've kept silent, been quiet and held myself back. But now, like a woman in childbirth, I cry out, I gasp and pant." And the Cosmo article is called, "Why Are American Women Dying in Childbirth?" I cry out, I gasp and pant. Unfail your organs, open your eyes, irritate your nervous system by straightening your crooked places, giving you hands in hallways, hours, mountains, backwoods frying pans. Freedom flows from me into you, rivulets of justice, delight and terror, love and wilderness. You don't know, you can't understand. You keep crying out, drip, drip, dragging your soul like an IV behind you on your way to the sea or the weekend, or to prison, or to bed, begging to be born into some other kind of body, begging not to be born at all, to be held forever like breath. You don't know, you can't understand. Clots or sepsis, hemorrhage or cardiac arrest. I feel what you feel, bear what you bear, lingering among your acids, tearing myself to shreds, transfusing your suffering with my glory. You are with I am. That is the poem that opens the collection. There are 22 poems, one for each letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and that would be sort of the Aleph poem. So it's before 3 sections of 7 poems each. First section is called Revelation, and the Shekhinah is talking to a human you that she knows can't hear her. This poem is called Stillborn. You're still being born, still trying to understand what you are and where I am, inside or outside, attached or disattached, still digging, still scraping, still filling with time, still buried, still growing, still waiting to be delivered. I know. I'm the neighbor who's always watching. the teacher who's sometimes kind, the mother who sees how hungry you are, the doctor who makes you sick. Sometimes I stagger you with terror, but I also cover your body with flowers, pinks and sweetheart roses. When they wilt, I remain. Before you're born and there in the casket, you are still my favorite color, a cloud I continue to ride even when you're no longer moving, a love into which I keep falling even when you're no one, nothing, stillborn or miscarried. I still surround you like a uterus, and you are still my baby. One of the big questions probably in all religions, but certainly in Judaism, is, human beings are supposed to be made in the image of God, but God is not supposed to have an image. So what exactly is it about us that is similar to God? What's the connection between humanity and the divine? This poem is called Likeness, and the Shekhinah is talking about that. Like me, you're hidden in skin, in time, pinned like me to a world you endure, in which you hover, holy and ordinary, full of blood and suffering, rejected, forgotten, shoved to one side, mouthed and named in the language of shame, instead of your mother tongue, my tongue, the language of revelation. Like me, you can't escape the world that's inside you, waiting to be healed, to be forgiven, waiting for you to be less like a victim, less like a crime, less like a body grabbed at dusk, less like saying nothing, and more like the face you think I'm hiding, more like woods and wings and water, more like conceiving and giving birth, more like overflowing. One of the, big problems with being human, maybe all of the big problems with being human, come from the fact that we are embodied, right? We live in and through bodies. If we didn't, it would be hard to have prejudices, inequality, hunger, think about all the problems that wouldn't be there. So the Shekhinah is, at this point in the book, talking to a human you who knows that she's there and trying to explain what the connection is. Like, what does she see in us that makes her want to be with us, with these messy bodies? Your body. You keep trying to escape the body I love, the blazing crush of physicality, impurity, and shame, separating you from yourself, from your soul, from me, the body I formed in your mother's womb, delivered, dandled, nursed, and comforted, the body that fails you in so many ways, through which you struggle to materialize the way tomorrow struggles to materialize through today, blessing through pain, love through the flesh I made to be a place where you and I can rest, hang out, go crazy for one another, marry, say goodbye, apologize, consume and burn like incense, plead, pledge, proclaim, be held and protected, given and accepted, born and born again. It's me you feel moving inside you, my presence that's so hard to reconcile with your sexual nature and the nature of sex that sometimes you feel violated, devoured. Tell yourself that you're no good. Imagine me demanding you preach gospels of fire, gospels of bone, gospels of coming to the end. I didn't make you to end. I made you a whirlwind of appetites and offerings I never stop wanting. Ceremony and sacrifice, wine and reckoning, comedy, coolness, birthing and healing, falling in love, romance, yes, and sex. Your body is a stream from which I drink, a hand I hold, a nipple I lick, a story I tell over and over, a Sabbath I keep for pleasure, a way of being alone, a way of being together, my choir, my throne, my crazy music, my dog-eared paperback. Idit, what do you think? Should we talk a little bit?
We can. Did you want to read singing as well, or
If
do
you
you want to
think we
hold
have
off?
time, I don't have no idea what time it is.
Why don't you share it, and then I'll join you.
Okie doke. Um, so this poem is called Singing, and in a way it was the genesis of me figuring out how to do this. It started because of I knew that I liked this epigraph from Isaiah. As a trans woman, I'd always related to um, the part where God says, "Sing out, O barren one who has not given birth. Break into song, shout for joy, one who has no labor pains." When I was trying to figure out whether there could actually be cosmopolitan articles that would resonate with passages from Isaiah, I took this part and I thought, well, let's find out. I went to the Cosmo website and I put into the search engine the word barren. And this article is the first one that came up. It was called, "Why This Woman is Proud to Be Known as the Pageant Queen Without a Uterus." And since the Shekhinah is known as a queen and she doesn't have a uterus, I thought, well, we're in business. Singing. Before you were a fetus, before you were an egg, you were a song I was already singing, a promise I'd already kept. I stretch out your curtains, strengthen your pegs, make room inside you for the world I created you to share. You are my embryo, and I'm your womb. You're my labor pains, and I'm the mother pushing you to cry, to talk, to stand for something, to stop being scared of the joy rising like waters in the days of Noah, flooding your foundations, crowning your head, answering every question I created you to ask. Why you feel incomplete, like a tiara without a pageant. Why you mistake affliction for love, and love, my love, for affliction. Why you just start crying when for a moment you hear me singing the secret you forget you're keeping. You are the child of a queen. Why it always feels like the first time to you, the first shaking of your mountains, the first bursting into flame, the very first season of your first reality show on which a queen with a whirlwind where a uterus should be, whose presence fills you with fear, keeps waiting for you to say, I do, to the love, my love, that never stops singing and follows you everywhere.
Thank you for sharing those words with us, Joy. When I read the collection, admittedly, just earlier this week, because the first copy that I had ordered was lost, so I had to order a new copy. It was very poignant and kind of startling to see the framing poem "Fetus in Distress." Given that last week and this week and perhaps next week we will see, so many of us are watching what shows up on SCOTUS blog with dread and anticipating severe dismay to come. So I was so struck by your use of that for the frame, not only for the framing poem, but then the prevalence of childbirth and pregnancy and uterus as words and motifs that appear throughout the collection. So I'd love to invite you to speak to both the presence of those themes in a collection of poetry called Shekhinah Speaks, and your decision for Fetus in Distress to be the framing poem.
Yeah. So when I was trying to figure out how to create poetry that wouldn't be me pretending to be the Shekhinah, but would actually just be a place for the Shekhinah to speak. I knew that I needed to use words that weren't my words. And it was sort of easy to think of sampling words from Isaiah, monologues where God is speaking, to use for divinity speaking, but those words are not marked female. So there was nothing to mark them as a place for Shekhinah. And that's where I got the idea to try mixing those words with words from cosmopolitan articles. And that's really the only thought that I had about it. I didn't think about what the consequences might be, and I'm not an avid Cosmo reader. I know you'll be shocked to hear that. I had no idea even what Cosmo was publishing. But of course, among the many makeup tips and consumeristic kinds of things Cosmo publishes, a lot of them are actually about women's issues and misogyny and really structural misogyny. I was surprised by that. I was surprised because I hadn't expected that the Shekhinah would necessarily be talking about anything that was so grittily related to the way our world works. But needing that language and mixing it together with Isaiah meant that it was sort of inevitable. So, of course, the Shekhinah is, because the Shekhinah is associated in tradition. I mean, there's a quote from the Zohar, that's the epigraph of the book, that says sometimes she's called mother and sometimes she's called sister. And she's all and everything's in her. Sometimes she's called daughter. So the mother stuff didn't surprise me very much, but the violence of that and the things about birth and not the, in this sort of hazy idea about birth, but the actual nitty-gritty about birth, like the fact that hospitals are set up in ways that guarantee that a lot of American women will die in the childbirth process for a number of reasons, including that pregnant women are not listened to by doctors. That's sort of built into the culture. So if you start having symptoms, they'll be like, oh yes, pregnant women are always panicking, and then you're dead of sepsis. So I chose that poem to begin the book because it's the Shekhinah really speaking from, that's her overview of human existence. She's trying to convince us that she's really there with us and that she's the source of everything. She's everything and everything is in her. And so she's trying to explain that we kind of come out of her, and so the entire world that we have comes out of her. And also but she's not experiencing this from that transcendent perspective. She's experiencing it from the inside. When we're the fetus that's in distress. But I think any mother who has a fetus in distress is also in distress at the same time. You don't get that kind of separation. And that's sort of the essence of her relation to humanity. And that's why that comes at the beginning of the book. But the structural misogyny that has that is erupting in so many horrific ways has never gone away. It's always been killing women and hurting women, not just in this country, but all over the world, is also a reason that, at least in the United States, many fundamentalists or more conservative traditional religious groups are also, misogyny is built into their structure. A lot of the coalition of the terrible that is hurting people now, are a coalition of traditional religious communities in which misogyny is part of the framework. So there's this glorification of a male idea of God, which turns into a glorification of patriarchy and structures that put men at the top and women below, and that equate women with their reproductive processes and devalue them in other ways. So that stuff, I wasn't thinking of it as political in those ways, but it is. And it's also something that the Shekhinah, as she's speaking, is trying to overcome, because that's also one of the reasons that these religions tend to be extremely anti-body, anti-sexuality of any kind. You know, do they hate gay people? Yes, because they think gay, that means sex, and that's bad. But they also hate other people where they think of them in terms of sex, right? So they're, in a way, it's all bound up with this root. So when the Shekhinah starts speaking, she's speaking from outside of all of that. And in a way, she's posing a challenge to all of that. She's saying, if you want to hear me, you're going to have to stop looking up there and out there and looking to men and maleness and distance and power. And you're going to have to start by looking for God in your life, in your body, in yourself, in the feelings that often we want to escape. And again, in our culture, feelings are coded feminine, right? So there's a lot of devaluation of feelings and repression of feelings. So I think that that's why when you read it, well, it wasn't written that way. I wasn't aware of this, but when you read it, I think it just chimed with a lot of things. And the other thing is that the anti-trans stuff is also really rooted in misogyny, because it's all driven by trans women. They're willing to hate other kinds of trans people. It's not that they're not willing to share the love there, but really it's driven by the idea of trans women. It's driven by trans misogyny, because femininity and femaleness are never such obvious targets as when they're associated with male bodies. And so in a way, the Shekhinah is, yeah, she is, to hear her voice is to throw over many of these kinds of structures and have to radically reassess many of the ways that our world is created. I don't know if that actually answered your question, though.
It answered a lot of questions and and opened up new ones, of course. One of which is, I was struck earlier this week, Joy, when you and I met to prep for tonight, by the kind of very familiar way you kept referring to the Shekhinah, and you were like, well, she says this and she feels this, and I've heard you speak before about your relationship as a child with God and the really richly textured sense of connection that you felt with God as a very young person. And I'd love for you to share that with the group, and then also speak to how did your relationship with Shekhinah come to be? How is it different, and how does it relate to that long time childhood connection?
That is a great bunch of questions. So yeah, because I grew up as a trans kid in hiding, I grew up feeling very, very alone and isolated and really unloved and unseen by anyone. My family would have said that they did love me, and they, behaved in loving ways and other ways too, but, definitely in loving ways. But I didn't feel that they loved me because I felt that they didn't know who I was. I was consciously trying to hide who I really was. And possibly because I was so alone, or maybe just as a coincidental blessing, I had always remember having a very strong sense of God as a living presence and with me, like God, I felt God with me. I think that that's a capacity that most people have, but I think that secular culture devalues that sense of presence. And even in cultures that are religious cultures, it tends to be structured, it's bound up with organized religion, you're taught to look for it in certain places and not in other places. And also, people who are not like me, people who identify with their social identities and feel connected to those around them, there's usually more interesting and fun people to hang with than God. God is just not that fun to be with if you're a human being, particularly if you're a kid. God just doesn't want to do anything that you want to do. But if you are utterly isolated, God's the best you got. Like, God was the only person when I talked to God. God was the only person I felt who knew who I meant when I said I. Everybody else, I knew I was lying. I was saying I, and they thought I referred to this male kid that they believed that I was when I was someone else. So we had that kind of relationship, and I further bonded with God because I felt that God shared a lot of the same problems. Nobody could see God either. And in the Torah, nobody can remember God's there. God doesn't have a pronoun problem in the Torah, but in, this week's Parsha, as Seth would no doubt want me to say, but in the entire book of Numbers, over and over again, the Israelites, who have God literally traveling in their midst, the pillar of fire, manna, and everything, they keep really not being able to remember who God is, and how God is with them. And God gets very angry at them, and they get angry with God. And it felt to me like God and I were similarly socially disadvantaged because we didn't fit into the human categories that are the basis for the ways that human beings relate to and recognize one another. Gender is a way of identifying ourselves in a way that relates us to others. Neither God nor I could fit into gender in that kind of way. And so I felt like we were alone and outside together. I never thought that God had gender. I never, paid any attention to the capitalized he's in the Torah. I knew that was silly. So when I started this project, I was wondering, like, why? Why am I doing this on the one hand? But also, why would there be a female aspect of God? Like, why would a being without a body want to bother with gender? And my early Shekhinah poems weren't really about the Shekhinah, they were really about trans identity. The Shekhinah, when I read about her, reminded me of my own unlived female identity. Didn't have a body, was female, wasn't recognized, was sort of evanescent. But also the thing about the Shekhinah is you can't see her, she doesn't get to do anything, she doesn't get to speak, but she doesn't ever go away. And that was the other thing about my sense of female gender identification is it persisted no matter what anyone did or whatever I did. It was always there. So in those poems, Shekhinah was just like a figure for that identity. But I knew I wanted something different here, and so I had to get to know her. And I realized that I was right as a kid. A being that doesn't have a body and is beyond all human categories is not gendered. However, when God wants to have relationships with human beings, those relationships have to be human relationships. It's like if you're a cat owner and you want to have a relationship with your cat, you have to relate on the cat's terms. The cat is never going to understand you. You can't say to the cat, please just let me read finish this article and then I'll feed you. That never works with a cat. They just rip the newspaper, right? And God is in the same position with human beings. Human beings can only create relationships in human terms because of our limitations. So when we gender God, what we're basically doing is we're taking this mechanism, gender, this system of language and relationships that help us feel close to and connected to other human beings, and we're using it to open a channel of connection to God. It's like we're looking at God through the keyhole of gender. So when we say, God is my mother, God, you're my mother, please be merciful to me the way a mother is merciful to her children, we're not saying, I've now named everything about God. We're saying, God, this is the way I want to know you right now. This is the way that I want to feel close to you. So the Shekhinah is kind of consenting to be in relation to us through gendered terms. But I also very quickly realized that unlike the gender binary, Shekhinah, who is, in binary gender, the female is the opposite of the male, but also the subordinate. So it's the opposite, but less. You could imagine just being the opposite, separate, but equal, but it's not like that. But I realized, no, the Shekhinah isn't less. She's divinity. And so she's not going to be pinned down to any particular set of roles. So she uses these terms like uterus, I still surround you like a uterus, and you are still my baby. That gives me chills. I don't know how else she could say that that would be as effective for me. But that doesn't mean that for the rest of the book, she's talking about her uterus and you know what I mean? It's like she uses that to create a certain moment of relationship and then she's on to the next thing. She transcends it. I also realized she kind of had to educate me in order to do some of this stuff. She's outside of time. So if you notice, particularly in those first two poems, all of the U's life exists at the same time. You know, I give you everything. I give you, you know, hands and hallways, and I'm opening your eyes, and I'm also there as you're dying. And, you know, to her, it's everywhere all at once. This was a tremendous comfort to me when I was with my mother in her last hours. And I realized, you know, from the Shekhinah's perspective, death is just a limitation of human perspective because every moment of us continues to be alive in her. And I didn't think that that was much good, actually. I had a little argument with the Shekhinah. I was like, well, you know what? It's actually a bigger deal for us than that. But when I was with my mother, somehow I felt that. I felt like, yes, to me, I'm losing access to my mother in the present. But I felt strongly that every moment of her was still going to continue to be alive. So the Shekhinah is looking for ways to communicate to a human you. And one of our limitations, one of the keyholes that the Shekhinah is trying to fit through is we really do think we live in time. That we're one thing and then we're another thing and then we're another thing. And we think that God is the same way. You know, we find a parking space. Oh, God is so good. I live in a universe with a benevolent God. And then, you know, we're audited by the IRS. Why would God do this to me? I've been a good person. Why do I deserve that? Right? So she is trying to find ways to speak to us so that we'll just really recognize that she's there with us in our sequential struggles, but she's constantly inviting us to identify with her in ways that enable us to step outside the anxieties and step into the love.
There's so much I would like to say and so many new directions I would like to take us in, but I want people to be able to hear at least one more poem from you, and then leave some remaining 10 minutes for people to have the opportunity to ask you questions. So is there one poem you can share, Joy, and then we'll open it up for questions?
Yes. And how are you feeling now? Would you like we talked about one of queer justice kinds of poems? Should I do one of
I
those?
think we need a lot of queer justice in our world. So yes.
All right. So this is a poem that I did know actually was kind of the Shekhinah being political. It's the first poem in the second section where she's talking to the you, and the you is hearing her. For her, she says all of the poems all at once, all the time, which I can't even handle. And the Isaiah quote is quite famous. It's, "Come, let us reason together. Though your sins are scarlet, they shall be white as snow." And so you have this very traditional sin language that is built into a lot of the religious cultures that are anti-queer and anti-woman. And the Cosmo article is by the great Jill Filipovic. It's called "The Duger Parents Aren't Victims, They Are Perpetrators." And for those who don't know, I didn't. This was an evangelical Christian family that had a reality TV show all about, you know, the very pure, wholesome life, you know, extremely misogynist. And then it turned out that one of their children, their wonderful children, was sexually abusing his sisters. And that created some PR problems for them. Come, let us reason together. Your head is sick. Your heart is sick. Bruised from your soul to your crown, you hide your devastation under your clothes, even though I'm right here, replacing the poisons in your blood with my oxygen. I know what you've done and haven't, where you like to be touched, and why you think you should be punished. But don't confuse me with conceptions of God that sneak between your body and soul and shame what I delight in. I'm not a conception of God. I'm a burning city, a moon full of blood, a wound to be washed, soothed, protected. You think I come to you for sex? You're an angel I make in the snow, a prayer I offer, a trauma I bear because you can't live without me, and I want you to live. Sometimes you see me in the mirror, sometimes in your bed. Sometimes I'm a thread you follow back to the pleasure I take in the body, your body, I made to be a festival and a feast, a booth in a cucumber field, outside the structures of oppression that hold you, rear you, put you to sleep, rape you through your clothes. Come, let us reason together. Stop doing evil. Start doing good. Learn to tell one from the other. You are born to burn for justice as a garden burns for water. That's why I come, night after night, so you and I can burn for justice together.
Burning for justice. Let's open this up to hear questions that people have for you. I have a question for you, Joy. How does Judaism inform your relationship to the queer community?
Well, I'm not totally sure that I understand the question. Part of that is because, due to the way I grew up, I don't have a great sense of community. Like, it's a sense, I think it is an actual sense, and it just didn't develop for me. So I'm happy when I realize that I'm in a community, but it's hard for me to sense it. And I'm not, when I was teaching at Yeshiva University, I experienced real communities. And I realized that a phrase like the queer community is kind of a metaphorical community. It's saying people who share a certain characteristic can think of themselves as a community and can act as a community. But at Stern, community, you knew you were in a community because people would gossip about you and they'd bring you food when you were sick. And, there was all the good and bad stuff of actually having people in your business all the time and know who you were. So at the same time, I would say that most of my connection to queer community has been mediated through Judaism. So I think that being Jewish, and for me, the Jewish and trans stuff, they're intertwined in ways that I usually don't find it worthwhile to try to tease apart. I think that that's really marginalized me in terms of the non-Jewish LGBTQ organizations. And at the same time, it's brought me very close to, well, Keshet. I doubt that I would have found my way to Keshet if it hadn't been for Judaism and for Jewishness being so important to me. And I think the plus of that is that the queer Jewish world is pretty small. It's small enough that it starts to turn into, from a metaphorical community, into a real community in ways that, like the national American gay community, I think just is metaphorical. I think it's just too many different kinds of people spread over too much territory. But I have met many Jewish queer people precisely because my trans identity is bound up with Jewishness. And so it's brought me close in that kind of way and facilitated, I think, personal and rich connections that I might not have had without it. So I think it's been a good trade-off in the sense of
Thank you. This is a question that several people have posed, which I think, speaks to both the power of your words and what people are seeking in these times. People are asking you, Joy, where do you find hope? What gives you hope? And I would add to that, kind of just in general, as you move through the world, and particularly in these times.
Well, I want to say, first of all, that I grew up without real hope in a way, because I didn't know how to envision a future. Judaism told me that I had a future, that every Jewish kid has a future and is obligated to create more Jewish futures. But as a trans person, I couldn't see any future for me. Nobody taught me that I was valuable, or America needs trans people to do blah, blah. There was no sense of that. So it took me a long time to learn to hope. And I think it really, in a way, started for me during a very bleak part of transition. It was just an awful time. And my best friend decided to keep me from killing myself by giving me a new middle name, a new Hebrew name, Fool the Angel of Death. And she chose the name Tikva, which means hope. And I thought, I was mad. I was like, oh, darn, now I really actually have to learn how to hope, because, that's in the name. And what I've discovered as I've made connections with people through living as myself, through going out in the world, through speaking and listening and traveling around and trying to give, I've discovered that the world is actually filled with incredible people, great people, heroes. And I grew up believing that the human race was all people who would hate me if they knew who I really was. And what I discovered was I was just really wrong. Not that there aren't people who are happy to hate me, but those aren't the people who define humanity for me. So that is a source of hope. I know that when I am feeling lost and in darkness, I know that there are other people who are just fighting harder. Mm-hmm. Another thing that gives me hope is the history of Black resistance in this country. I know that whatever I'm feeling overwhelmed by, it is a fraction of an eyelash compared to the people who endured and kept hoping through slavery and through Jim Crow and through, police shooting you on sight for walking down the street. So, when I really want to buck myself up, I'm like, oh, come on. If Black people in America don't give up hope, then I am not allowed to give up hope. And the Shekhinah just laughs at me when I give up hope, because the Shekhinah really has been there and done that. There is nothing that we do to one another that's going to make her go away. And she says in one poem, she's talking about fear, and she says, I was there before fear, and I'm there beyond it. Trampling kings underfoot. She knows that the power to transform, the power to tell good from evil and do good, that is always with us, and that it's up to us to shift our perspective so that we can keep claiming that power, keep making those distinctions, keep recognizing the heroes that really do surround us and that keep this world running.
Well, there are many more questions people have for you, Joy. There's a question about the Zohar and what are your insights into the warnings that people before a certain age stay away from the Zohar at risk of possible mental breakdown. There are questions about the power of poetry as a mode of expression for queer Jews in particular. So I'm putting those, there are questions around what are you reading now and what writers do you like? I think people want summer reading recommendations. So I'm putting those questions out there to let you know and to let everybody leave with these questions on your mind. I want to thank you so deeply for bringing your words that are words of burning for justice, that remind us that there is a presence and a power in the world that exists before fear and will exist after fear, and that we can hold on to that. As some of you may have noticed, our Keshet's theme for Pride this year has been Pride is Love, Pride is Jewish, Pride is Political. And I think we can also add to that now that the Shekhinah is all of these things as well. We can be held by that. We can be reminded that our tradition holds us, our tradition needs us, and our tradition will power us forward. It will power us forward through these times and will power us forward through to better days. So thank you to all of you for being here tonight. Thank you so much, Joy, for being a part of this evening, for being a part of our world and for enriching our world. And Chodesh Pride Sameach to everyone. Happy Pride Month to everyone.